This story is Gunnlod. I'm going to totally butcher her name. I apologize. This is a story about the mead of poetry. Gunnlod is the mother of Bragi in Norse mythology. So this story really needs to be remodeled. It's very misogynistic. And the heroine is missing. Let's bring her back into the story. As I want to retell stories, that allows us to create healing in our own narratives in our lives, as we have many possible narratives and we don't have to fixate on the negative or traumatic event. We can use our imaginations for good. So this particular story about the mead of poetry is particularly about a drink, mead, honey wine, given by the gods to those who are worthy, as poetry as the language of the gods. And these are words of starlight, and it's difficult to understand spirit as it's multifaceted. So I also want to bring in a little bit of the wisdom of yogis and bring the word Shatiki into this, as Shatiki is the creative energy of the goddess. When the language of the gods pours through us into creative fire, the Shatiki in poetry, in art, and in all creative acts, even acts that are not very exciting, like setting the table or making dinner or brushing your hair. These are all creative activities for ourselves to allow the divine to speak through us. And when we get very relaxed, if you create things, when you're relaxed, you're able to create works of beauty and be connected to the divine. So when my poetry is perfect, when my dinner is tasty, when my art is attuned, it's because I'm very centered and relaxed, and I can tune into that. So this particular story, is recorded by Snorri in the poetrySD. And so I'm bringing a little bit of feminine and balance to these Norse stories, which tend to be super male dominated. And let's let the Shatiki energy and light her fire. Just bring that in just a wee bit. So once upon a time, the gods were at war and they were fighting each other, and they were like, you know what, this is dumb. Let's make a truce. And so they all stood around and shook hands together like, yep, we're not going to fight anymore. And they all spit on the ground like, no, we're not going to fight. And the spit grew into a new god called Kvasir. And Kvasir grew from all these gods. He was like all the saliva of all the gods into one person, one god, one being. And he knew everything. He was like Master Jeopardy champion. He could be asked anything and he knew the answer. Any type of wisdom, any type of poetry, any type of description, any maybe math problem, he knew the answer. He knew how many ounces were in a gallon. And so everybody ran to ask him things, and his footsteps were the beauty of the life of the plants. But Kvasir was wise, and he knew it made no sense for all the wisdom of the world just to be within him, that it wasn't right, and he needed to transform it from being just this one person to be able to share this wisdom with everybody in the world. And he was invited to visit these two dwarfs, Phalor and Galor. And perhaps we'll just say that he was bursting at the seams with this wisdom, being contained with this wisdom of the gods inside him. And he did not want to be in there anymore and could not hold inside his body. Dwarfs prayed for divine guidance and took the body of Kvasir and drained him of his blood and mixed it with honey. And they made this magic mead of poetry and put it into 3 vessels, a vat and 2 barrels, if you want to get technical. And they tasted a little taste of it and had the divine wisdom of the gods. And what they learned is that the mead of poetry was also not for them to keep in their little dwarf house. Maybe it was a big dwarf house. That the mead also needed to be transformed and changed into something further. And so when the mountain god, this Jotun, came to their house demanding payment for a blood debt, because the dwarves weren't angelic dwarves. They had killed this Jotun's parents. And so the dwarves said, hey, you know what? We've got this mead of poetry. And they felt like that would be a good transformation. And the god of the mountain said, ooh, mead of poetry. My daughter, Gunnlod, would like this. And so his daughter Gunnlod was his creative fire and his shatiki, and she would love to have the mead of poetry in their mountain home. So she gets hold of the mead of poetry, and she's pretty stoked. She puts it in her room, she studies it, she nerds out about it, she has a little taste of it. She's like, oh wow, this is so cool. Maybe it's like amazing weed or something where you get really inspired, or being around a group of friends and you just feel like vibrant and alive, and her excitement and joy and the feeling of her soul colored her entire life. She painted, she drew, she wrote, she had fun meetings with her friends, and everything she said was perfect poetry. And then in the mead, the goddess of her, this goddess of this mountain, this Jotun, an old god, had that same wisdom of Kvafsir, that the mead wasn't really for her either, that it needed to go to the world, and it also needed to like be born from her in some way, that she was pregnant with this potential child, this god of poetry that lurked within her. And so she sent an offer out into the world with her feelers that the mead of poetry needed to move from the mountain. And Odin, because he's a good listener, he hears the calls. And he tries in his like usual trickery ways to get to the mead of poetry, but nothing worked. But he did manage to drill a hole into her room. He transformed himself into a snake. You know, they're very like clear about how he got through the hole. And then I imagine he transformed himself, not into like old man Odin, like missing the eye and the hat and looked like an old Gandalf, but someone beautiful. But only when the hole is drilled in the rooms near Gunnlod does he find a way to his object, to this mead of poetry that's really also part of him. And he sees the beauty of Gunnlod and is inspired by her. And he transforms himself into a beautiful god, not this weather-beaten old Gandalf wizard that we think of as Odin, but a young viral god who sees the shatiki before him. And Odin kneeled before her, and he admired her beautiful warm rooms and the bare fat candles and bear skins and the paintings and the art and the poetry. So the firelight was warm on the stone walls, and he made his offer that he would lie with her and bring this child that was laying ready to be born and allow it to speak the poetry to her. And he would lay with her for 3 nights in exchange for 3 sips of the mead. And she smiled, and she brought that shaman king to her bed and conceived Bragi, the god of poetry. And when their time had passed, whether it was 3 days, 3 months, or 3 years, Odin stood in front of the vessels of poetry and took his 3 sips and drained those vessels. And she was no fool, this goddess of the mountain, about 3 sips, meaning 3 giant sips, because she knew the meat didn't belong to her. It belonged to the gods. It belonged to people. It didn't need to like stay locked up in the mountain. And she was hoping that the mead of poetry would transform this world and make it beautiful and allow spirit to talk to the mortals. And there is no point in keeping it locked up and safe when poetry needs to be spread and spoken throughout the world. And it allows the gods to speak with the mortals, as poetry is nuanced like dreams and art, and it can be seen in many different ways. And then when Odin was ready to go, he's all full of mead, he kisses his Gunnlod, his poetic bride, and transformed himself into an eagle and went back home to share the mead of poetry with the gods and the mortals that are worthy of this gift. The mountain god, he sensed the loss of his mead, and he transformed himself into an eagle because he was unaware that this child, the mead of poetry, had been transformed into the child within the daughter. He didn't know that the mead had transformed himself into a child within the belly of his daughter. And so Odin ran away from the king of the mountain, and he spit all the mead of poetry just in the nick of time before he was caught into this big vessel. And we know that this mead of poetry is within the gods of their ability to speak, and also the gods dispense the mead of poetry to those among us today, like Lao Tzu, Bob Dylan, Diane DePrima, Shakespeare, all have obviously been given a touch of the mead of poetry. for divine inspiration. And because this is a little silly and random, Snorri added this little bit that because Odin, as an eagle, had swallowed some of the mead and he pooped it out, and some of the poop landed on the human land, and that is the origin of bad poetry. Is when they got eagle poop on their heads, and that's why it's terrible. So the land and origin of kitsch. Kitsch. Kitsch, kitsch, kitsch. Bye. Have a beautiful day. Thank you for listening.